Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
I'm joined by Parker Longbaugh, who is an American fiction writer. I know he sort of calls himself a pulp writer, but I feel like he is broadly speaking to the what we'll call New American metamythology. So I'll let him introduce himself in the ways that he wants to, but I think this will be a really interesting discussion. It's been a long time coming, just at least in my own mind. Like the idea of having Parker on as a guest has been generated a long time ago, but I finally kind of made it happen. So thank you so much, Parker. Really appreciate it for coming on. I know I'm probably unknown quantity, but it's exciting nonetheless. And I love your Substack. So please introduce yourself and tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate you inviting me on, Jin. I followed you a long time on X, and I like some of the stuff that you put out there. I feel like we have overlapping interests in as you say, metamythology and how that impacts modern society. So Parker Longbaugh is my pen name. Professionally, I'm a psychotherapist. I was originally trained as a Jungian psychotherapist in graduate school, but I mainly work from a cognitive behavioral therapy model these days. In my 20s, I was in law enforcement for several years before going back to graduate school. And yeah, here online, I do a lot of pulp writing. I grew up reading all of the great pulps, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and then like all of the writers that essentially descended from those models. Also a big fan of crime pulp, like Mickey Spillane and his ilk as well. I have a Substack called Parker's Pulp Revolver, where I try to throw up stories every single week. And then I also put out a book this past fall called Darkness Over the Potomac, Stories of Hard-Boiled Horror. Mainly it's a pulp book of short stories that just kind of deal with the intersection of DC parapolitics, Lovecraftian horror, and cults, and hard-boiled action thrillers. That's about all I can think of off the top of my head.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, like, okay, so you were trained as a Jungian, so we could have fun. We could like go far, we could go like deep red book, mystic territory. I won't make you do that, but I'm just saying we could.
I actually have the red book. It's one of these things where I read like a chapter a year, and I just kind of have to let it like slowly sink into my addled brain.
I feel like it is so potent. I feel like it is a mystic text. It's like non-dual gnosis right there, right in front of you. So when you read it, it's brain melting, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, but in a good way, and maybe in a cosmically positive way. I noticed that you mentioned H.P. Lovecraft. So obviously, I don't know if you know this, but this show has had a lot of like left-hand path practitioners, as well as a lot of like chaos magicians come on, and I've interviewed them. So there is a kind of obsession with H.P. Lovecraft, which I don't share. I like H.P. Lovecraft. Like, I think it's cool, but it's not necessarily my flavor. Now, you mentioned Robert E. Howard. I am a huge Conan nerd. I've never really gone full otaku Conan on the show, but people know because it ties a lot into a meta mythology that I talk about, which is called Hyperborea. So I take it more from his sort of Hyperborean, like I guess, archaeohistory or archaeofuturism, and I sort of replace it with America as like the place where it all happens. But yeah, I'm really into Robert E. Howard. I think he got a lot right, and I think it's more interesting than, in some ways, than Lovecraft. But you can fight me on that.
It's funny. Of the three that I mentioned, now I don't write like him at all. If you compare his writing to my writing, it's nothing alike. But I've always been a bigger fan of Clark Ashton Smith. I love his Hyperborea world, and it just has like this dreamlike quality that I don't know. It feels more real to me than Robert E. Howard's Hyperborea. So that's actually the stories that in fact I stole one of his characters, a guy by the name of Zatampra Zeros, the one-handed thief, and written a couple of stories utilizing that character. But his Hyperborean stories are just, yeah, they just have such an amazing dreamlike quality. And my favorite conspiracy theory is that the creators of Dungeons and Dragons utilized Clark Ashton Smith's model, not Robert E. Smith's model of Hyperborea, but his Hyperborea model to create Dungeons and Dragons, because the Tale of Zatampra Zeros came out in like 1931 or 32. It's the first dungeon crawl story that you'll ever read. It reads just like if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, traditional like old like AD&D like second edition. The Tale of Zatampra Zeros is a classic dungeon crawl about two thieves.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, and I appreciate that you corrected me, like Hyperborea versus the other Borea, because it is an important distinction. But I also think, like, to reference the Clark Ashton Smith story, it has the two thieves in it. And I know you kind of have a preoccupation with these kind of, I wouldn't say they're always rebel heroes, but there is a kind of, I'd say there's a mythic archetype which you tie to the American man, which I would agree with. And I think you could actually make a really, and I think I have, but I think you can make a really interesting, like Kabbalistic or like a metaphysical argument that the nature of like the American hero is very much tied into the rebel and the anti-hero both, and like it's not necessarily, as we were talking pre-recording, it's not the lawbreaker, but it's also like someone who's maybe an outlaw. Do you want to like get into that and like discuss like what you think of it, and instead of me trying to explain your position?
Yeah, I mean you know, I'm not a Buddhist, so you know you can correct me in terms of this, but I always feel like, yeah, the American consumer public, they enjoy reading about essentially the archetype of the Monkey King, the fool who acts like a clown, but underneath that mask, he's actually a very competent warrior. And you see this throughout you know, movies, television, books. I mean, if you read like old pulp, you'll also see this as well. This really came into fruition, in my view, in cinema in the 1970s. You see this all the time with spaghetti westerns. You'll see like these Italian heroes or anti-heroes who are very clownish. You know, they look kind of clownish, or they're doing things that are kind of clownish. But then as soon as the bad guy shows up and starts pulling out pistols, like these guys suddenly become hyper competent gunmen. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel like the archetype of the Monkey King is always been like very present within American consumer culture.
That's a really interesting point. I'm sure that you knew that I was going to like that, which of course I do. I love that. You know, I feel like the story is called Journey to the West. So
Right.
like right there, that's an interesting sort of we'll say cosmic positionality for the Monkey King and his kind of mythology to inhabit, is that he's going to the west. Well, they mean India, but it doesn't really even mean that in the text. It actually means he's actually going to retrieve a sutra, like a magic text, really a magic booklet, and he's going to bring that back to China. And then there's a variety of sequels that came out, but a lot of the book is actually, a lot of the story anyway, is actually just a foundational sort of myth of post like Ming Dynasty, so like early 1600s China. And this is when the idea of the Jinshan, like the Golden Mountain, which obviously my name means gold, so it's tied in sort of, that they locate in California. So it is tied into like the gold rush, the idea of like this mythical, people think of the Turtle Island as like being strictly indigenous, but in Chinese cosmology, there's actually one of the 4 cardinal protectors of the world is it's called a turtle snake, or it's a tortoise, but it has a serpent's tail, but it's like a serpent's face on the tail. So it's kind of like a dualistic serpent. But you could say that actually there were these ideas of like a mythical other sort of new world. So and then you can see that with a lot of the early Cantonese and I'm trying to think of the other diaspora that came. That at least the Cantonese will say that the early ones that came, they really believed it. Like they really believed like this is the journey to the West. That's even how it was often sold to them, and it ties into like the Boxer Rebellion and these European forces encroaching from Europe. There was this like secret third thing, America, or in my case Canada, and like they could come here and work on the railroad or mine for gold. And it was kind of like a way to get outside of the narrow confines of like warlords and pirates, which I know you often discuss in your work. So I feel like the Monkey King is a very American story. I could see it set. Okay, so when I was a kid, Parker, I would read a lot of Mobius comics. Like Blueberry was a favorite of mine.
Oh, yeah.
And I would often imagine him as kind of a Monkey King character. Because I think that like that trickster, like you were saying, like there's that mythic archetype of like a trickster. And you specifically mentioned like the Fool card in tarot, which I think is really interesting. Because that would be a really good archetype for right now if we're thinking like Sefer Yetzirah, like or Yetziratic astrology. Like if we're thinking like Kabbalistic astrology, the Fool card would be sort of timed appropriately for where the planets are aligned. But there's one thing really interesting about the Fool card is the Fool card can actually flip into multiple different archetypes. This is unconventional if you're using the Golden Dawn system. I won't get too in the weeds here, I promise. But the Fool can flip into the Magus or the Mage, and it can also flip into the Saint. So it has a flexibility to move through quote unquote the proverbial tree, the tree of knowledge, if you want to call it that, or just a person's life or their story or their pathway. It has a particular flexibility, and I agree with you that the American public loves a trickster, because who doesn't love a trickster, really?
Absolutely. Could you say then that that idea of the Fool is that it's more of a mask that one can put on and take off at will?
Okay, well, this is a really interesting question. Is it someone that is like a jokester their whole life? Or is it, as you're saying, is it like a position one can take metaphysically? And I would have to say it's both. And I think, though, it is a mask once you become in perception of it. Like once you're aware that is your position on the tree, you can no longer say you inhabit it naively. Like it's no longer just your natural way of being in the world. You actually recognize that you have to take off that mask sometimes and do other things. So I think it's both.
Interesting. It's just that when I working on this, my current story, part of it comes from this deputy sheriff that I used to work with, who was very much a very clownish guy. Like he never really seemed to take much seriously. Was always playing like little practical jokes. Was very much like a trickster. But every once in a while, I would witness him in a very serious situation um, drop that persona. Like I remember one time we had to go to this parking lot where there was this aggressive, heavy drunken redneck just being a nuisance. And this deputy approached him and was trying to engage with him, and this guy just went completely aggro on this deputy. And suddenly, I saw him execute like just the most perfect hip toss I've ever seen anybody execute in my life. And it was amazing because I had never worked with him before. This was the first time he and I had gone to a call together. I remember talking to some people afterwards about like what happened, and they're like, "Oh yeah, so and so has a black belt in judo." And it never occurred to me that this guy is like this guy like seriously is studies judo seriously. The guy's like a judoka, and it was just an amazing experience for me. I think that was the first time in my life where, because I was a very young adult at the time and didn't have a whole lot of life experience. And this was the first time I'd come across somebody who, yeah, really like wore this sort of clownish mask, but when he was in a very serious situation, suddenly took off that mask and or maybe pivoted to the warrior archetype, if you wanted to use the idea of archetypes.
I think that's a really fascinating story because it is very. There is something. I know you said you weren't a Buddhist, and obviously, I mean, you are. You can identify however you want, but there's something very Asian. Like there's a metaphysics that is very Asian about that story, quote unquote Asian, because the idea of like the Taoist saint, like the Xian, which is obviously a play on words of the show's name, is the idea of being a little bit of the fool, like all what we would call like Chinese pulp, like manhua, like the wuxia characters that exist like underneath reality in the rivers and the lakes.
Mm-hmm.
Like their reality, they are outsiders. Like you were saying, the 1970s cinema, and I agree with you. The American 1970s cinema, like cinema of the outsider, I think that's a really good analogy. So there's these kind of like outlaws, but they're not lawbreakers. They're just outlaws. They exist outside. They have a separate code of honor, separate code of conduct. Some are good, some are evil, and some are neutral. But all of them kind of have these Taoist characteristics of like being a drunkard or being like really lecherous. And I don't mean in necessarily like a Me Too creepy way. I just mean in it's like a comical way, like a Hong
Right.
Kong cinema kind of way.
Right.
But they have all these like kind of character defects and flaws. But then at the drop of a chopstick, maybe you could say, they will spring into action. So I really love that you said that, because I think that is a very common trope, and it plays back into the fool archetype again, because that is it requires the flexibility of that to switch into like something that's a lot more like the warrior.
Right. I mean, I grew up in very rural Vermont, but at a young age, I was studying in different martial arts schools, and my teachers were all men who studied various types of Japanese martial arts when they were in the military. And so because of that, because they had Japanese teachers, they were very interested in teaching us kids the idea of what's it called in Japanese? Giri versus ninjo. Giri being like duty, obligation, ninjo being like personal feelings, desire. And they would constantly tell us, look, American society is just pure ninja. It's just pure, personal desire. I want what I want it now. But if you're a martial artist, if you're a true martial artist, you have to be willing to engage in guri. There are duties and obligations that you have to perform. And I think that has just always stuck with me throughout my life. So I think because of that, I probably have like that Eastern flavor inside of my Western body.
Well, I think that's perfect. I think I even think that the sort of the balancing of like duty and obligation versus desire, like even that framing there's something very interesting to me metaphysically about that. And you want to say it's from Tantra, or you want to say it's Kabbalah, it's both really, but I find that very interesting. And I also think like, yeah, it makes sense because the earliest transmission of Buddhism to the West really was GT Suzuki with Zen. And obviously it carried through with martial arts, and the Koreans brought their own sort of style of like their kind of yin yang kind of balancing, like the way that they think of metaphysics. But like definitely that Japanese militaristic sort of more Zen, more samurai ideas, that definitely was the first, you could say it was the first introduction of Dharma. Something I've been really interested in on the show is like, where are we in American Dharma, and how many transmissions have there been? Because there's this idea in like Asian Buddhism that different countries have had received multiple transmissions, and it takes a certain amount of magical number transmissions for it to take root. So I don't know. I feel like that's a cool place to start. Like Zen, we're breaking all the statues right from the get-go, but then we're also saying, okay, there are a series of obligations here. What are they? And also we have to examine our personal desires. So I'm sure as a therapist, that probably interests you still, or not, you can say.
No, absolutely. And it's, it's hard living in the current society we live in, because it's all about, we're living in the burnt out structure of the boomers, right? Where it was like, there are no obligations, there are no boundaries, burn everything down. And living within that burnt out structure, all of us are I feel like are trying to find our way when it comes to looking at, duties and obligations that we need to fulfill. And are we willingly going to essentially enslave ourselves to these duties and obligations, or not, or reject them?
I personally think that we're sort of doing our own thing. That's sort of been my perspective lately, is that we're moving in our own kind of direction. But this might be very, schizoteric, like metaphysical opinion, but I just feel like we're just moving into a new phase. Like you're saying, we've seen the burnt out tunnels, we're aware of them, we've perceived them. And you brought up at the very beginning dungeon crawler. So I always thought this was really interesting, because there's obviously a Kenneth Grant. One of my co-hosts calls him Kenny G, so it always stays with me that his name is Kenny G. Shout out Solar. So the idea is like we're trapped or lost. I prefer lost in the tunnels of Set. So like these deep caverns under the earth, very sublunary, subconscious realm, as Jung would say, I think. And I think some of the newer ideas, or at least some of the more interesting like tantric ideas that I think about, is that actually, if we are told that we have exited the cave, if you want to call it Plato's cave, or if we have the potentiality to do it. It doesn't matter what religion you are. There's ideas in Kabbalah, in Christianity, in Buddhism, in Tantra, all of that. That is, as long as you're told the possibility of leaving the cave, or that the nature of the cave is the nature also of reality, if we understand and recognize it without sort of obfuscation. If we're told that we are, then we, in our consciousness, we're able to do so. So I like the idea that, it's I think I'd like to liken it to like Dungeons and Dragons, and to say like, yeah, maybe actually the new sort of like formation of America will be this escape from these quote unquote tunnels of Set, or the dungeon of the boomers, or the longhouse, as I call it the longhouse, no pun, and the bathhouse, both. So we're leaving the places where people try and fuck you. That's kind of my pun I make on it.
I think that's a great analogy, John.
Well, why don't we talk about Roper a bit? I didn't mean to derail us with the tunnels of Set and the Dungeons and Dragons. I wanted to bring it up again, because one thing I loved about your new short story, that I assume will have multiple parts, is that, first of all, he is amoral. he is the most amoral of all the characters in the film, at least.
Mm-hmm.
He's not necessarily the most violent, and he's clearly not. Like Bruce Lee is clearly the most violent character. Well, I guess that's debatable, but I would say that it could be him or Han. But I think that a lot of the more traditional Hong Kong directors would definitely say Bruce Lee's character is by far the most violent. But Roper occupies sort of this watcher positionality where he's the witness to these things, but he's also a participant. And he's also a bit of a womanizer. So maybe he occupies kind of that third space Taoist saint position a little bit.
Yeah, I think he completely does. He's a hedonist, right? When you meet him, the great thing about Enter the Dragon is they have those wonderful flashbacks, and in his flashback, you see that he's a scammer. He's a con artist. He's a professional con artist. The only reason why he's heading to Han's island is because he heard that Han has some money. He's like, maybe I can like scam this guy and get some cash out of him. And at the same time, though, when he meets with Williams, they serve together in the army during the Vietnam War, and you could tell that he has genuine affection for Williams. So that really softens Roper's character in that he could be amoral, but he also understands friendship, and you see how far he's willing to go with friendship by the end of the movie, because when Han shows him the mutilated body of Williams hanging from the meat hook and saying, I made the same offer to your friend, but he turned me down, and so this is what's gonna happen to you if you turn me down, making that threat essentially. And in that moment, Roper goes from acting like the sort of clownish fool scammer to he becomes a warrior archetype in that situation, and decides, no, I'm gonna take you down. I'm gonna burn this place down.
Yeah, I love that. I think that was very astute to pull like those character attributes from him, because I think that, like, especially in context to like when the film was made, like you're saying it's post Vietnam War, or maybe just ending, and there's this idea like Asia was especially Southeast Asia was like spook central. So I know that might interest you perhaps as like also like doing crime fiction writing,
Right.
but it really was, right? Because of the Golden Triangle and sort of like the machinations about who controls it. And so I think it's interesting that he's kind of like the scammer. You see this archetype a lot, especially in Hong Kong films of this time. Golden Harvest did not shy away from like the kind of amoral American archetype. But like you're saying, he's actually kind of a good guy. He's actually kind of like a true Jung-Hoo or Wuxia character hero.
Right.
He understands like there's an oath bound, sort of like there's an honor system, like there's a code of conduct to which that you value, like loyalty, fidelity, like all those things. So I totally agree with you that to me, I also always found him interesting as a kid. So I don't know if I'm telling on myself or anything, but I find him like he's a very multi-layered character. And so when I saw that you did a piece on him, I was like, oh, he must be seeing similar elements.
Absolutely. There's really, Roper's the only one who has a true character arc. Bruce Lee is amazing in that movie, but Bruce Lee is playing Bruce Lee. Like there's no real, he's a very flat character. Bruce Lee is going to the island to kill the man who pushed his sister to suicide, and he also has an obligation to the Shaolin Temple to take down Han, because Han's a former monk that was part of the temple, so he's violated his code. But there's really no growth with Bruce Lee's character. He has a mission and he goes and executes the mission. The end. Whereas Roper is, he's given Han gives him the devil's deal. Like, you work for me, you can have everything. You can have money, wealth, women, power, whatever you want. And initially he's like, that sounds great. I'm all for that. And then he shows him what he did to his friend, what he did to Williams, and he's like, no, this is a boundary. I will not. There are some. In fact, isn't there? I think there's like a line in the movie where there's like some boundaries. There's some boundaries I won't cross or something like that. I'd have to rewatch it to see the line again, but it's a great line because it shows you that there is a boundary that Roper, as much as he's kind of a con artist, he won't cross. Whereas Han has broken all of his ideals as a monk. He's violated every boundary. There's no boundary that Han will not violate at this point. He's fully embraced the darkness. And it's clear that he initially assumes that Roper is the same as him, and then realizes that, oh no, like this guy actually does have a boundary that he won't cross.
Yeah, that was great. Legit. I never really read Enter the Dragon in like a sort of like Buddhist magical parable, but like the things you're saying to me, it's sparking a lot of ideas. So like Han as the antinomian monk, like the monk who is the transgressor, or as we would say, inverted conduct. That's like a very tantric idea.
Okay.
And so that's really interesting to me. And then also like Bruce Lee as the avenging sort of quote unquote, we'll call it the avenging deity, because Bruce Lee was very highly criticized by a lot of, as I mentioned, traditional Hong Kong directors, none more so than Car Leung, who directed multiple Jackie Chan movies, Drunken Monkey, or Drunken Mantis, and many, many classic Chinese martial arts movies. And he said that the problem with Bruce Lee was Bruce Lee brought, I think it was in a 1982 Cahiers du Cinema interview that I remember from undergrad. So I apologize. I'm not trying to be pedantic about the source quote. It's something that stayed with me my whole, I guess my whole adulthood, is that he talked about how Bruce Lee was a bad vehicle for sort of Taoist metaphysics, Buddhist metaphysics, and like martial arts in general, like the Chinese worldview, because he was so ultra violent that there was no temperance of spirit or of physicality, which he felt was really like important to the portrayal of like this Jung or Wuxia underworld. So I think it's really interesting because you can say then that like Bruce Lee's character, as you're saying, he plays himself. So he is like this ultra violent, like no holds. There's no boundary that he won't cross because it's obviously he's on a mission. He's single pointed. But then Roper actually is the one who kind of like assesses the situation and says, yeah, actually there is a cause. There is like a cause worth fighting for that is beyond sort of the confines of like this Manichaean black and white. And of course, as a amoral character, he's positioned in the gray and able to perhaps make the, I would say, make the most morally apt choice.
Yeah, absolutely. In the moment where he sees William's mutilated body hanging on a meat hook, he understands that he has his obligation to his dead friend is greater than his desire to want money and women in power.
I always found it really funny because you were bringing up the women. He has obviously a weakness for women, as many Taoist saints do, of course. So he chooses the madam at the brothel, which I always thought was an interesting choice, rather than Williams, who chooses all the girls, really.
Right.
So I just thought it kind of humanized him and also showed him in like a specific age. Like he was kind of almost a Philip K. Dick everyman hero, a little bit more than the others because of that. He chose a more human consort, you could say.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd never thought about that before. Obviously she's very beautiful, but yeah, he could have been like Williams and just selected a large group of women to spend time with. it also makes you wonder, like, the lifestyle he lives is probably a pretty lonely lifestyle, whether he recognizes it or not. And he's trying to reach out and develop, um, an intimate relationship with a woman who's sort of on his level. At least that's one of the potential readings that I saw in terms um, of him picking her, the head madam. And he has clear affection for her, right? When he sees her body at the end, like the John Saxon unfortunately never gets the acclaim because he was essentially a character actor throughout his career, but he's a really good actor, and he's so good in terms of his facial expressions, and you see that look on his face when he sees her body at the end, when he and Bruce are fighting all the henchmen.
I think that's a really astute point, and I think that there's actually a really good, not to be like over referential, but I think there's a really good Chinese wuxia film that sort of exemplifies like what you're talking about. It's called Intimate Confessions of a Chinese Courtesan, and it is between like a sort of police inspector who's quite amoral himself and like his love interest who is sort of a girl at the brothel, and she's not, but it's not she's not just a girl at the brothel. She is like the girl at the brothel. She gets to like pick and choose who, she consorts with, I guess. Um, but I think that that's a good analogy to your point, is that like a martial hero would look for another martial hero, someone who exists also in the sort of like interstitial or underworld layer of reality. And it would make sense that like a brothel madam would be an equivalent underworld character. So to me, that makes perfect sense. I think that's very clever that you link them together like that.
You said it much better than I did, Jin.
I don't know about that. I think sometimes I get a little lost in the, metaphysics, but I think that there's like a common language to sort of relay the similar ideas. And I think that a lot of people understand, like just from a literary or like from your perspective, like obviously you have multiple, you're multi-layered like that. And so that's how I try and be, but I don't know if I'm always successful in saying it. But so thank you, Parker, for saying that, is what I'm trying to say.
No problem. But it's talking about this type of character, it also reminds me of John Woo's Hard Boiled. Chow Yun-fat is kind of a similar character, in that he's kind of he's kind of a clownish type of character in many parts of that movie, but when push comes to shove, when he's going to take down the bad guys, again he drops the monkey's mask and utilizes the warrior archetype. So I think that that's just another really good example of a similar character.
Oh yeah, I love that movie. I don't know if you knew that, but that's definitely, I mean, that's pretty much like anyone who likes Hong Kong cinema. Hard Boiled is high up there on the list, and Chow Yun-fat,
yeah.
of course, right? So definitely, I love that film, and it's interesting because John Woo is a hardcore Buddhist now, and I think he's always has been like quite a devout Buddhist, but you can see a lot of interesting Chinese metaphysics in that sort of series of John Woo films. Is that he'll pan sometimes just very, very briefly at the very beginning. He'll enter the police station, which you described in your own work, your latest piece. But when Chow Yun-fat's character will enter into the police station, there'll be a statue of Guan Yu, who is the martial saint. So he is the protector of policemen when he holds his halberd in his right hand, but he is the protector of the triad when he holds the halberd in his left hand.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So as someone from the diaspora, this was something we were always taught, is that you don't ever say anything if you notice it in the opposing hand. So I just thought, wow, that is kind of interesting. That is kind of what you're talking about, like a polarity switch. He's able to be the clown, but then he can become the hero who has to take down all the bad guys. But it's the same God. It's one God, right? Like it's one divine officer.
Right. Yeah, when in Christianity, you've got Saint Michael, who's considered the patron saint of law enforcement officers, and in his right hand he carries the scale to weigh your soul, essentially, and in his left hand he carries the sword of justice.
See, that's a really interesting parallel you're making, because as I was talking about Guan Yu, I always think of how I've always felt like they were very similar. They're both very martial. I mean, maybe you could say Guan Yu is more like Saint George, but there is a relationship between Saint Michael and Saint George. Like they're very closely sort of enmeshed in folk Catholicism, and you could
Right.
definitely say Saint Michael has this interesting position in sort of the South American magic. I don't know if how much you're aware of it, Parker. I guess you live in Florida, so you must be aware of it to some degree.
Oh yeah.
But so there's like practices like Kimbanda and Santeria and
Yep.
like all these Afro-syncretic things. They often position Saint Michael as a saint of the sort of infernal spirits. So he's like he keeps them. He's like the policeman for all the goetics. He keeps them all in line. But if you pray to him when he's like in that form, he's not Mr. Nice Guy. He's not like, oh, I'm going to protect you from evil. He's much more like, you will follow my rules. Like you have to follow my ritual prescriptions. You can't just do whatever you want. So I do
Right.
think
Yeah.
that that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean he is judgment. So if you pray to him, just be careful, because if you're not living in alignment with traditional Christian practices, he may judge you harshly.
That's a great word, alignment. That's something I would identify him with very strongly. I think that makes sense. And then depending on whether you saw him as like a cosmic, quote unquote, good figure or a cosmic, quote unquote, bad guy, he obviously would act according to the alignment, just like D&D. Just
Right.
like how there's all I like to think of myself as like chaotic good, but sometimes I probably veer into chaotic neutral, but who knows? Why don't we talk about your book, Parker, Darkness on the Potomac, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to hear your sort of give me your broad overview of parapolitics in the DC area, how you understand it, how you view it, and its relationality to, I know you mentioned H.P. Lovecraft and sort of the abyssal mythologies. Why don't we explore that for a bit?
Sure. It's funny because a lot of the origin of several of the stories in the book came from a Call of Cthulhu gaming group I ran many years ago. I sort of inherited this group. Initially, I was looking for a gaming group, and I found these guys who were doing Call of Cthulhu, but the original game master was in the military, and he was being stationed to another location, and so he kind of handed it off to me and said, "Okay, well, you've got a good sense of imagination. Like you're the game master now." And I had never, I'd played Call of Cthulhu in college, but I'd never been a game master before. And so I started asking the other group members, like, what are you guys interested in? Like, do you want to play, do you want to do a modern setting? Do you want to do a jazz age setting? So you're playing within Lovecraft's lifetime? Do you want to go back further? And some people wanted to do uh, one guy suggested the Revolutionary War, and then another guy was like, oh, let's do Jazz Age Call of Cthulhu. Then two others were like, no, we want to do modern, because they basically wanted modern weaponry. So they're like, we want 21st century Call of Cthulhu. And so in order to appease all of them, what I ended up doing is each one of them had to create 3 characters. And so we did 3 different settings simultaneously, one during the Revolutionary War, one set during the Jazz Age, and then a third one set during the 21st century. And in order to create these 3 different time periods, I just started going out. I'd been living in the DC area for several years at that point, and DC is very weird in that like you walk around and there's the typical statues and historic uh areas of Washington D.C. that all the tourists know, like Washington's Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the National Mall, and all that. But there are also these very strange um, other monuments and statues and things like that you sometimes there's a plaque that will tell you like what's going on there, and then the other times it's just there like um the what is it, if you ever want to look at something interesting, type in Scottish Rite Temple, Washington D.C., and you'll see like I don't know if it's like the headquarters for the Scottish Rite temple in the United States or what, but it's a crazy looking building. It's right out of like I don't know what you would call it, Neo-Egyptian architecture. It's just like a very crazy looking building, and there are things like that like all over DC. And looking at that stuff just started sparking my imagination, and it just started making me think about like, well, what if there were like powerful cults out there that were involved in not only national politics, but what if you just had cults just kind of operating based upon ethnic groups? Like one of my stories deals with a Caribbean cult that's worshiping the Black Pharaoh, Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, and then just utilizing Lovecraftian gods as the servitors of these different cults, what they're serving within DC. But then you have groups of people that occasionally come across these different cults and want to do something about it. And that's sort of the origin of Darkness Over the Potomac. And all of the stories kind of deal with these hidden cults that they're moving and they're existing within everyday life within Washington, D.C., but they're doing very dark things. And some of them are very old. Like in the book, one of the biggest cult groups is run by the Ball family, the Ball family of Virginia. Hopefully they don't sue me because the Ball family does actually exist. But I always found them to be, how should I put this? Something off-putting about this family. And I don't know if they still exist, but there used to be all of these high society magazines in the DC area, like Northern Virginia magazines, and they were all filled with wealthy groups of people who would put on these different charity balls. And the Ball family was constantly putting on like various, charity balls for like, pagan babies in Africa or what have you. And it always seemed very strange, very weird and off-putting to me. This very wealthy family that is just, they're hooked into, this is long before, I knew anything about Epstein or anything. They're all like, the Ball family is hooked into like all of these NGOs, and these NGOs don't really seem to do anything. So maybe it's just, money laundering. I don't know, but it just really sparks my imagination when I read about like these very powerful, wealthy DC families who've been around since like, the Ball family's been kicking around since like the 1600s. There's a neighborhood in Arlington County that's literally named after the Ball family. That's how long that they've been, this family has just been kind of doing whatever they're doing out there.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the Scottish Freemasonry, so then we can just go full, well, we don't have to go full parapolitics, but I do think it's really interesting that you bring up, like, your book is about the idea of cults, and this is something I talk about a lot, is that, like, what is this kind of like elite cosmology that we're looking at? And then what are all these quote unquote antinomian groups subsidiary or part of it? So my sort of broad thesis will say, I'm not saying that you'd find it necessarily interesting, but I think it's interesting just from like it's a little different than most other people. I see it as very Zoroastrian. I see everybody as sort of like doing their own thing. But then there is like something you said that is so contemporary to modern American magic, the use of H.P. Lovecraft like abyssal gods as servitors. So I
Mm,
know people who actually do things like that. I'm not saying I approve or disapprove. I don't really think in those terms. I just like, stick to my own Buddhist stuff and that's all I do, but I'll talk to everybody.
right.
But you know, I do think it's interesting because obviously Peter Carroll, RIP, he talks a lot about this, and there is like there's a working group that focuses a lot on chaos magic and H.P. Lovecraft, and they see themselves as more transgressive against these kind of like older elite families, like the Ball family, like you're talking about. But if you took more of a normative Christian perspective on them, you'd say they must be the bad guys. They're like existing in these like in the tunnels of darkness. But then you brought up the idea of NGOs. And so this is an argument that I've made, Parker, is that I think that NGOs actually are part of the Klepothic or Setian or Chthonic structure of America, because they're so tied into government. They're so tied into like all these things. It's so opaque. Like you were saying, like, is it just money laundering? Is it to change the world? Is it to influence opinion? Well, all of those things could have, whether they're nefarious or not, they kind of exist outside of like the normative landscape. So for me, I agree with you that there is something that is kind of nefarious about the origins, but then there's also like you brought up the Scottish like temple. There were obviously people in like I don't think the Masons are like of any great power anymore, but there were clearly at its origin of the US Masons who thought themselves the great builders descending from obviously Tubal-Cain, and they were like, we're going to bring the magic of Egypt, which is something the Golden Dawn is very interested in. Bring the magic of Egypt. We're going to like reposition it in America. And you see this all over the US, like all over like Tennessee, Kentucky. I'm not just thinking Memphis, but like even where you live, like all over the South, Texas, you see a lot of names of towns. You see a lot of Masonic monuments. You see Masonic signs on the graveyard. I know where I live, there's so many people who are in the Masons, and you can easily just go into any cemetery and basically you're going to see it on every gravestone or the Eastern Star. And I think that a lot of people were interested in like this idea of like building a kind of positive institutional force. But what I think happens is that the institutional and the sort of antinomian powers, they're not really that different. They sort of, there's a point where they kind of converge. I don't know if you'll like that as like a former like a former officer, so I apologize. But I do think there's a point where sometimes they converge, especially with the boomers. I think
Yeah,
they
I
kind
mean,
of lost sight of it. Sorry, go ahead.
no, it's okay. I think for me, it's more like the idea of levels. Like I had a grandfather who was a Freemason, and for him, being part of the Freemason was just being a Freemason in his community was just it was really like a men's club where they would work on different projects to better their town, and for him that's probably all it was. But at the upper levels of Freemasonry, maybe there were some other things going on, perhaps some darker things. I'm not saying that there is or there was, but within my book anyways, that's how it works, is that at the cultists at the lower level oftentimes don't know what's going on the upper level. If the members of the Ball family are worshiping Shub-Niggurath, the lower level cult members don't necessarily know that. They think they're just part of an NGO that wants to change the world in a positive way. So I think that really came from. So I live not far from Clearwater, Florida. One of the things that Clearwater, Florida is known for is they're the corporate headquarters of Scientology. And Scientology is famous for that, right? In terms of you spend your entire life going from level to level to level, and it takes time and money to move from one level to the next level. And there's the idea of with every level, you're gaining more and more knowledge about what this organization does and what it really is supposed to do. And so, yeah, I think any good Lovecraftian cult is divided by those levels. So again, the people at the lower end have no idea what's going on the upper end of those levels. And to speak, and it doesn't surprise me that there are people out there who worship, Lovecraftian gods, because Lovecraft himself took a lot of the names of gods from real. I mean, Dagon was a real Phoenician god that people at one time worshipped. I know I've read some, and I utilize this in my book, the idea that Shub-Niggurath, the dark goat of the wood, mother to 1,000 young, she's an aspect of Lilith, and that makes total sense if you look at how Lovecraft created this deity and what she does and what she ultimately what she wants. Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense.
That makes total sense. For me, I would say that, well, I know this is a contentious issue on Twitter and I don't want to get you in any trouble, but I will just say that for me, I think that you're saying this, but you can dispute it. But for me, for sure, I think that Lovecraft is a totalizing like Gnostic cosmology. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot of reasons why this is a big reason why magical societies draw upon it, because I think it actually is talking about real metaphysics and real, like something it's drawing from a more traditional sort of quote unquote small g Gnostic ideas of the world. Because Gnosticism really depends on your perspective. Like, who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Where are you? Are you in the tunnel? Are you outside the tunnel? Are you looking upwards? Or are you looking downwards? So for me, 100% makes complete sense. And I'm not making a judgment either on Masons. Like I think that I think it comes down to the individual more than an institution per se. I just think, but I do like the idea, as you said, levels. And I think this is very Manichaean as well. Like that's a old religion that has supposedly died out. And so in my most maybe far-ranging ideas, I still think that people have a lot of Manichaean sort of tendencies, which is a very dualistic. It's very like anti-Red Book in a way. It's very like the world is very black and white when it's really, I think it should be more gray. And so the idea in Manichaeanism is that there are distinct levels of society, and there are seers and hearers, and speakers as well. So you have like those at least 3 levels. So you have people that are, like you're saying, like they actually believe that they're like doing something generative, cosmically positive. And then there are people maybe at the higher level that are actually worshiping these anti-cosmic deities. So whose intention, whose will cancels the other out? Well, that's interesting, because I think if we're going to look at like, obviously I'm more of a sci-fi guy, but I clearly love pulp fiction as well. But if we like say Philip K. Dick, okay, it makes sense. Like, and every hero can actually change his mind. He can be like a drone in the corporation, but then he can actually become this other thing.
I'm glad you mentioned this, because sometimes I've had people who have read my stories and will talk about, well, this is good versus evil. And I disagree with that. I mean, there is, there are obviously some good people fighting evil people, but it's not always that case. I've got a couple of stories in the book that it's really more about a contest of wills. I have one particular story about a Mongolian judoka fighting a Chinese triad member, and neither one of these men would be considered good or evil. I would argue it's a contest of will. It's a genetic contest of will between these 2 men who, just through blood memory have hated each other. The Mongol versus the Han Chinese. Like, how far does that hatred go back? And so you have this contest of will between these 2 men. Who is going to survive? And I think in the best of pulp, quite frankly, it's always about the contest of will. I mean, Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer is a perfect example. I would argue that that Mike Hammer is not a good man. He's a necessary man, and he's a man of violence. That in his world, you need this type of man because there are greater forces out there, or men that want to do more evil things than he wants to do, and so you need this man to exert his will upon other men. But I like that idea of, this is a contest of wills. This is not a narrative of good versus evil.
I think that if we're looking at, I don't like the idea. I'm glad you're saying this, that you agree with me, obviously, or in general. I think an appraisal of the world more as, I call it non-duality, but people can call it whatever they want. I think that that is probably more useful to most people, because I think that, like, okay, so we'll just use a broad example of saying like war in any specific place. Like for me, if I can't necessarily see that, like see the impact of it, if I can't even physically see it on social media, if I cannot like be on the ground, it's probably not that useful for me to necessarily think about. I'm not saying that like people aren't affected and it's not real. I'm just saying for me, maybe my consciousness or my will is spent like refining what that even is, rather than focusing on like like on ephemeral sort of political ideas. So but I understand that this is controversial, because then people are like, well, are you saying like you don't care? That's not what I'm saying. But I think you can apply this very broadly. And you say like things aren't really about good and evil. There's always like, yeah, sometimes there are clearly instances where there is good versus evil. And there are clearly things that are good and are evil. Like, are we impeding on someone's will? Are we hurting someone? Those are probably things those are definitely things we should try and not do. But then there's this other thing where it's like, are we viewing good and evil because they're framed as good and evil? I guess that's where my real contention is. When things are framed as good and evil, that doesn't even necessarily mean that they are. So if we can break that convention, I think that we get a much clearer but also more complicated, nuanced, contextual view of how things really are. I don't know if does that even make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Okay, good.
And I
didn't
think
wanna...
this was, you like you said before, like our society. I'm glad you taught me about this idea of Manichaeanism, because I've heard the term before, but I had never really looked at it very closely. But I think you're right. Like we exist in, especially here in the West, the United States, and in Canada, especially, the boomer culture is very, very Manichaean, right? Like it's all about that duality of like black and white, good and evil. Racism is evil. Equity is good. Diversity is always good. And if you live by that type of Manichaeanism, your society is like as it is now. It becomes like schizophrenic.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We are reaching like a kind of generational syncretism. We have so many different worldviews present, especially with the internet. I think the internet both is like in a way, I know people will think it's weird, but I do think it's kind of a blessing, because we can do things like this. We can have like discursive, sort of like operant discussions about the nature of reality or fiction. Maybe that's the same thing. But it also creates these kind of like blinds, these kind of like narrative confines, as well as like narrative obfuscations. So I totally agree with you. I think that I don't blame the boomers 100%. I think that Gen X has some culpability. I call them the forever rebels, Parker. Like I think that anything good, Gen X will always say that is bad, which is fine sometimes. Sometimes you need like the naysayer to like make things real or to make things better. But I do think that they tend to go a little strong in the, the no camp, we'll say. And I think millennials use irony. I mean, I'm a millennial, so I use irony a lot, but sometimes I think that it's more of a, as the kids would say, the Zoomers, a cope. And then the Zoomers use this idea of sincerity, which is really the opposite of what we would mean. So they actually mean like insincerity, as in like who you present yourself to be rather than who you quote unquote are. So I think we're in the middle of like a generational, what's that Japanese movie? A battle royale. That's exactly what it is. Everybody's
War on
competing.
everyone.
Exactly. Everybody's fighting, but they think they're fighting on teams, but they're actually fighting for themselves. I think that's the problem with the generational discussion. There is like obviously people who the system worked for. And I was on a different podcast, and I'll shout out like that. Both of the hosts were like, it was the Esoteric Archives, and they were like, people who the system works for, they're not going to ever go against the system. So that makes sense, right? Like if people like have become successful as boomers working the conventional way, the methods, then they're obviously going to be for that.
Right.
But like there are boomers who were kind of left out of that, boomers who weren't successful, boomers who lost things in the crash, in various crashes. And then there's the multitude of people within all the generations, some of who have experienced success and some haven't. And I think that what the problem is like, I'm not saying it's like a class struggle or like we're going to like this post left or like left right syncretism. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that I do think that the division is a lot more ideological. Like we were talking about Manichaeanism. I think that like the division of like where we go as a society is a lot more ruled by this black and white thinking. But I think that what I'm trying to say is I think it can also be mediated by the individual. Like, who are we and where do we think we fall along those lines? Do we believe those lines do exist? And also, can we say that maybe there's good ideas over here and maybe there's good ideas over here and maybe there's a way to like marry those good ideas and we don't have to be bound by, what one generation thinks is good and what one generation thinks is evil. I don't know. That was a lot. I apologize, partner. You can respond to that.
No, it's this is a good discussion, and kind of to expand upon what you talked about earlier in terms of technology. I just view technology as neutral, right? It can be, like we could use technology to have this great discussion that we're having. We could also use technology to build a bomb and kill a bunch of people as well. So in any age, I think it's important to utilize the tools that you have to make your life as best as you can, and perhaps to find those people that you can gel with and that you can work with and build relationships with. And the internet is a tool that makes it easier on everybody. Imagine, even before the invention of the car, like 125 years ago, you and I would just be living, we'd be living in a city, maybe we'd be living in a small town, but I'd probably be living in a small town, and whatever ideas I had, I probably couldn't, talk about that with the people around me. Certainly not the people that I grew up with, growing up in a very rural place like I did.
I love that you say that, because that is one of the reasons I started podcasting, was so I could have we'll call it extra normgroid discussions, like about magic specifically, but also like very much like this, and just like free range and see where it goes. Kind of you're drawing from metaphysics, but you're not necessarily married to it. So I love that you said that, because I also live in a very rural place, and I live like amidst a lot of rural people that this would not be an acceptable discussion. And I'm not saying because they're super traditional or anything. I'm just saying that this is not like it would have to be very specific. So right. I think that I agree. Technology is neutral. Techne, you said it in a very magical way. I'm really impressed, but I'm not calling you out or anything. I'm just saying, that is a very chaos magic, like operator kind of idea, that Techne as quote unquote deity or as a actual material thing is neutral, and it's about what the operant's will is to utilize for, you know, whatever purpose, selfish or worldly or something else, liturgical, etc., etc. But I also agree that we are in an age or an aeon of like extreme potential when it comes to knowledge gathering and knowledge synthesis. So not only can we speak like you and I speaking together right now, but we can also look up things. Like never has there been a time where I can read like Substack, all these writers, all these thinkers, all these philosophers. I can go to YouTube and listen to 20 million different ideas, worldviews from all over the world. I can go to Internet Archive, the CIA archive, also very good if you're interested in magic because they have all the grimoires there. Well, they do. And so I just think like we just live in a really interesting time, and it is a lot about um, you do have to form connections. I think do have to form kind of like these connections where you're interested in looking at similar material, or you're kind of moving in similar directions. Maybe your material is different, but your kind of worldviews are colliding.
I think that that's a really important idea, Jin, because information gathering is easy now, but synthesis is just as difficult as it's always been. And I think having other people around to help you with that process of synthesis is super important. I've met too many people over the years who they're very online, but they really have no network of people that they can engage with, or if it is, it's a like, you know, it's something like X. It's very surface level, and I think that without having those strong networks, you can't synthesize whatever it is whatever information that you're gathering.
Yeah, I totally agree. Synthesis is obviously the goal of every magician. So it's like number one most important thing. Maybe rectification also, and equally as important. So you're marrying the solar and the lunar, you could say. It's like very much it's the two things together, the gold and the silver together. So I could not agree with you more on that point. And I also think I want to end on one thing that you mentioned in a few Substack posts ago. So I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to bring it up if you don't remember, but I think you will. Because I don't necessarily identify fully as the archetype, but we discussed this a little, of the warrior, but I definitely see myself more as the mystic, we'll call it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the role of the mystic in this new American meta mythology, or just in historical pulp fiction in general? Like, where do you see them or him going? And do you see them as a force for cosmic generation or cosmic destruction, or both? Or any thoughts on that?
Well, I view the role of the magician probably more from the Jungian perspective of the magician. From the Jungian perspective, at least from what the text that I've read, is that his job is to be the first, to be the guide, if you will. He is the first to descend into the underworld and to gain the treasure, the knowledge, and then to resurface and to teach others who want to learn. So I guess like a shaman, if you will, is like a good example of the Jungian magician archetype. So that's my idea, anyways. You know, he is the trailblazer. He is the first to go down into the underworld and to receive the treasure. Now, unfortunately, there are magicians who go down into the underworld and they never come back, or they're maybe possessed of something darker. Something darker attaches to them, and when they come back, they're used by this other entity. I'm trying not to get so metaphysical in the weeds, but I truly believe that this is what a cult leader is. A cult leader is a shaman who descended into the underworld, and they either never left the underworld or something else attached to them. And when they come out of the underworld, now they're trying to gather followers for them to utilize and be parasitical towards, if that makes sense.
No, this makes complete sense to me, Parker. I appreciate that you elucidated that because I agree with you, and I think that's a really that's such a sick framing. Like a chaos shaman descends into the underworld, just like it's like the primordial story, really. So I personally love that, and I agree, and I don't think that was too metaphysical at all. I tend to take a very anti-spiritualist and anti-supernaturalist approach when I explain things, because I think that, well, for partly because of the reason that you sort of touched on, is that I think people get really lost in this idea of spirits and what those are and how they're related to us, and like maybe the different parts of us, maybe our psyche or subconscious or our waking mind or our sleeping mind, like different religions have different ways to describe it. So I think it's important. I personally think it's important when I articulate it to not get caught up on the spiritual quote unquote forces of it, but I agree that they exist. So I don't disagree with you that people come back and they have alternative characteristics, we'll say, maybe chthonic forces attached to them. I could completely, yes, I agree. So I also think like maybe as a Buddhist, I'm unique in the sense that like praxis for us is everything. So we constantly recognize that we're on the path and maybe we are in the underworld, but we have to do the practices every single day as much as possible in order to sort of make sure we're always oriented towards the goal, which is obviously, if we're using the cave metaphor, is to go outside.
Mm.
So I think that people find that in different ways. Like you've mentioned several times, like judo. And I wonder, is that like something that you do to like, find your sort of reorient yourself to find your way? Or is it just something that you see in the world as like, because judo's a lot about moving with oppositional energies, sort of like magic in a way?
Yeah, for me, I've never really have attached that much spiritual elements to my martial arts training over the years. Uh, if we're talking about like just spiritual metaphysics, um, for the longest time, I was not really an atheist, but was definitely more of an agnostic. I was raised a traditional Catholic. I went to Catholic school, had to learn Latin, had to read St. Thomas Aquinas in Latin. Sometimes I think like my high school training was more rigorous than my graduate school training. Um, but then I strayed very far from the church for the longest time. Over the past like 6 years or so, I've come back into the church, but from more of you mentioned earlier folk Catholicism, which I thought was really interesting. I was going to interrupt at that point, but I decided not to, because if I were to label like my current spirituality, it would be a folk Catholic. I go to mass, I attend mass, um, but I'm really more interested in the folk side, especially of my ancestors. My family's been Roman Catholic for over 800 years, but they were French Catholics. They were Norman Catholics. And if you know anything about the Catholicism, that part of the world, it's very like heavily folk Catholic based. There were some saints that the church was not happy that the locals were venerating. So yeah, I'm very much into the idea of saints, archangels. In fact, there's really beautiful shrine to the Archangel Saint Michael. It's not Catholic; it's actually Greek Orthodox, but I go to it sometimes and will pray there. So that's sort of where where I guess my spiritual center, you could say, lies.
Well, I don't know I don't think you knew this, but my mom is Quebecois, like from Quebec.
Okay. I didn't know
So, yeah, so I did actually grow up French Catholic, like the same kind of like very similar kind of like French Catholicism, probably that your family,
that. Oh yeah.
yeah, practiced. And it's very like my mom was very religious growing up, like not Mexican religious. I'm using sort of a more Americanized metaphor, but she like very church oriented in her whole worldview. and we would go to mass all the time. I went to Catholic school for a few years. Definitely in my 20s, I experimented with this idea of being like an Agrippan Catholic, like where you practice like the Solomonic seals, but according to Agrippa, you go to mass 5 times a week. And so I was doing that. And then also like the saints. I love that you brought this up, like so much. Like the left-hand path saints were so fascinating to me, not really from an Afro-syncretic perspective, but definitely from a more European French Catholic, maybe you could say even Templar. I really love the idea of like St. Michael being left-handed, but then also you have other saints. Like I'm gonna just say a couple just because why not? But I'll have to have you on, Parker, if you want. If you ever want to come back and talk about folk saints and folk Catholicism, like this still is a huge fascination of mine, but it definitely preoccupied a lot of my early 20s. But
if you ever want to do an episode on just folk Catholicism, I'll certainly talk about my experience. And
absolutely, I'd love that. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. That sounds great. Well, I'm sorry that I derailed obviously into folk Catholicism, but I just couldn't not touch it after you said it. And I'll say thank you so much, Parker, for coming on, first time saint. So obviously, hopefully you'll come on a second time when we will talk about Catholicism and folk Catholicism and the pantheon of saints, or pantheon of heroes, if you want to call them that. But please plug your Substack and your Twitter, and so I'll make sure that all that stuff's in the show notes, so people can check you out and make sure that they can read your writing, which I think is really exciting. And I think it's, to use one of my words, like very aeonic and very like of our times right now. And also, if you want to have any final words, Parker, please feel free to, say whatever you want.
Thanks. Once again, I appreciate you having me on. This has been a great discussion. I really have enjoyed this. If people want to read my work on Substack, it's Parker's Pulp Revolver. Like we've been talking about, I'm currently working on a unauthorized version of a sequel to Enter the Dragon. Hopefully Paramount or whoever like owns the rights don't sue me. And my book is Darkness Over the Potomac, Stories of Hard-Boiled Horror. You can find that on Amazon. And once again, I'm glad that we were able to have this fascinating discussion today.